we're going to talk about the basics of acrylic paint today. Acrylic paint is a form of liquid plastic, so when it dries in your palette, you'll be able to pull those little things out and it'll still be flexible. For some reason, it doesn't like to come off of the lid of your palette, so if that's going to bug you, try to avoid getting that on there in the first place. You want to put down newspaper to protect your work area. Bring in a painting shirt or something like that to protect your clothes. It does stain clothes. There's nothing we can do about that. You should save a little bit of each color that you're going to mix in case you need to touch up an area. But when you really are finished completing your painting, the best thing to do to clean these out is let it dry. That's one way to do it with the lid off. Or you can take a paper towel and wipe these little puddles out and then go to the sink and clean it. If you've ever been splashed by a spoon at the sink, basically these little puddles act the same way. They'll splash up on you and splash paint water on you if you have a big glob of paint in there. And then make sure you don't leave my sinks a mess. All right, let's talk about your paint brushes. This paint dries really quickly and it's pretty easy to ruin your brushes. So these are brand new brushes. You can see a couple things. Number one, they're nice and white. The shape of them is nice and uniform, and they spring right back to the shape they are in. As you work, you may notice that your brushes, the color of the bristles change. This one here is stained green, but you can see it flexes right back. It's still relatively pointy. And now let's look at some brushes that have been abused. So a couple things. Again, this paint dries really quickly, so this brush has been left with paint to dry in it. You can see that it's hard and is really not going to be good for much of anything. This one may have had a couple things done wrong to it. Number one, if you leave it sitting down in a cup of water, it's going to cause the bristles to flay out, and they just kind of have a short-term memory, and they'll turn into this kind of mop-looking shape instead of a nice pointy shape. Number two, the person might have used the bristles to mix the paint. It's better to use the handle of the brush to mix your paint. Number three, they might have been too rough with it as they were washing them out. You want to just kind of gently work the paint out of them in some cold water, and that will make sure that your brushes are going to be good to you the whole time that you're using them. All right, so let's talk about mixing paint. There's a couple reasons you would mix paint. Number one, to change the properties of that color, to turn it into a different color essentially, or to make it apply better. A lot of these paints are going to take 2 coats probably. If you add a little bit of white to it, it's going to make it easier to get a nice opaque coat on it. So when you start adding some white to your red, you're going to start off saying, oh, that's a little too pink. I don't want it pink. But that color is going to darken as it dries, and it's going to look nice, and it's going to apply a lot easier. To show you what a color looks like as it dries, you can see this green here, this blue-green. The color in the palette is quite a bit lighter than the one that's dry on the surface here. The other things you're going to be looking to change are those properties of color. So hue, value, and saturation. So hue is where a color lands on the color wheel. So if I've got a green and I have yellow and I've got blue, but I don't have a blue-green or a yellow-green, I need to be able to mix that. So the way I would get this yellow-green here is by taking the green and yellow, mixing those two together, and I'll get a color that lives somewhere in between those two. Same thing here for the blue-green. If I've got green, I've got blue, but I don't have a blue-green, that's how I can get that color to be somewhere in between there. So that's how you change a color's hue. The other thing you can do is change a color's value. So value is just light and dark without changing where a color is on the color wheel. So our value, I can make a tint by adding white. I can make a shade by adding black. So that's a way you can change a color's value. The last thing you can change is a color's saturation. And a saturation is how pure or intense that color is. So again, starting with my green, I'm desaturating this one with gray. This is what's called a tone. And you can see I get more and more and more gray until I'm pure gray over here. So that's changing the saturation. Why would you want to change the saturation? Well, if you want your main object, your main thing to be nice and bright and in the forefront, these darker colors live in the shadows and they help push your main idea, your emphasis, to the front. Another way I can desaturate is by adding brown. So really we don't have any color that's just called brown, so we have burnt sienna as one of our browns. So as I mix more and more and more burnt sienna, this is the burnt sienna, I'll get a duller and duller green. The last thing I can do, and you can see that I get a similar color to just adding the burnt sienna as a complementary color. So in this case, the complement, meaning the color straight across from green, is red. So as I get further and further over, and then I have my pure red over here, you can see that I've also made desaturated versions of red by adding green to them. So that's another way to desaturate a color. Okay, so now I'm going to show you how to apply paint. So for the image for my reference, I'm using this tennis ball. So I can see I've got a couple different colors in here. I have close to this color in the bottle, but not quite. And then I get to more of a yellow, and then more to a white, and then more to a blue-green over here. So green, kind of a yellow-green, yellow, white. So what I needed was a color study. So I went ahead and mixed up all the colors that I needed. So the main color I need for most of the tennis ball is this green here. It's slightly more yellow green than the green we have in the bottle, and then I have versions of that getting brighter and brighter and darker for the shadow. So my main color, and then brighter versions of it and darker versions of it. So that's what I'm going to use to paint my tennis ball. So now I'll show you a couple ways that you can do that. For a hard edge type painting, what I did was take the original image and kind of draw it where I saw the colors changing. So I kind of made a hard line right there. That's why we call it a hard edge painting, and mixed up colors that would show each of those transitions. And this was the outcome. This is a pointillism style. I used lots of dots to create the transition and try to get the paint to mix a little bit on the project as I went. This is a cross-hatching style. Basically, it's made of lots of little X's. This is what's called a dry brush technique. Dry meaning that, yes, it doesn't have any water in it, but really dry meaning that it doesn't have a lot of paint in it. So as you see me work on this one, first off, you'll see that I have this pretty beat up brush. Hopefully none of your brushes look like this one. And I'll be trying to get rid of as much paint out of the brush as I can until it leaves just a scratchy kind of mark. So that's what I'm looking for the dry brush. This is a smooth blending technique. This is probably the hardest one to do with acrylic paint because it dries so fast. So you'll see me adding lots of color onto the project as I go, and lots of the original color to help kind of blend and smooth from one color to another.